Many of the civil rights leaders became elected public democratic officials at a time when poverty programs was dispensing $22 trillion. You got now a poverty industry that was born. Since 70 cents of every dollar spent on poverty in the last 50 years went not to the poor, but those who serve poor people. They ask which problems are not solvable, but which ones are fundable. And so once these black politicians became the dispensers of those funds, the poor became a commodity.
In what cities do blacks have the highest crime, suffer from the highest victimization rates from crime, the rottenest schools, the very, very poor living conditions? They are in the very cities where a black is the mayor, a black is chief of police, a black is the superintendent of schools.
In Washington, D.C., for instance, where we've had black leadership for 5 decades, 20,000 low-income blacks have been moved out of D.C. through gentrification. But no one discusses that because we're talking about institutional racism.
In Baltimore, where Freddie Gray was killed, Freddie Gray died in a van, I shouldn't say was killed, died in a van. Yeah. You have a city that's 45% black. City council is 100% Democrat. The majority of city council is black. The top cop at the time was black. The number 2 cop was black. The majority of the command staff is black. The mayor is black. The AG is black. And yet here we are talking about racism. I mean, it's absurd.
If political power meant so much, you would expect, let's in a city like Philadelphia, where a black is the mayor, a black is superintendent of school, black chief of police, you'd expect every living conditions to be wonderful.
If you look at what happened in Marion Barry's Washington, D.C., or Sharp James's Newark, or Coleman Young's Detroit, the black poor became more impoverished on their watch.
Why are poor blacks failing in systems run by their own people? The only way they can escape having to answer that question is to advance the notion that racism, institutional racism, is at play here.
All the incentives politically are for black leaders to blame all problems in the black community on the larger society. And that enables them to take on the role of being the defender of the black community against enemies.
The racial grievance industry in this country is alive and well. You can make a very good living spending all of your time searching out white racism and highlighting as an explanation for all the bad things you see going on in black America. You can still make a very, very good living doing that. That's what they do.
When it's convenient, we generalize the black community and we use the demographics of those who are living in the most troubling situations. We use the demographics of incarceration, of low income housing. We use that demographic to make a case that all blacks are suffering. And then when the money arrives, it goes not to the people suffering the problem, but those who are providing service.
You could point to a large number of Negro leaders who have consistently betrayed Negroes in a whole host of areas.
They aren't really Negro leaders. These are puppets that have been put in front of the Negro community by white liberals. These are parrots that have been put in front of the Negro community by white liberals. You can't name me a Negro leader who has been betrayed Negroes, who has not been endorsed, sanctioned, subsidized, and supported by the white liberals.
The goal is to tell black people that we're victims, that discrimination and racism remain major problems in America when in fact they don't. And they want black people to vote for the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party gets 95% of the black vote, and the reason they get it is because blacks are convinced that the #1 issue facing the country right now is social justice, racist white cops, discrimination, systemic racism, microaggression, whatever new word they come up with, and it's a bunch of nonsense. The #1 problem domestically facing this country is a breakdown of the family. And President Obama said it, I didn't.
We know the statistics that children who grow up without a father are 5 times more likely to live in poverty and commit crime. They're 9 times more likely to drop out of school, 20 times more likely to end up in prison.
One of the most comprehensive studies ever done about this concluded that black boys without a father were almost 70% more likely to be incarcerated than those with a father.
You're far more likely to end up in jail without having a dad than you are because of a white racist cop.
Our incarceration rate from the turn of the century up into the 60s was under 30%.
Before 1960, 2 out of 3 black children were raised in 2-parent families in this country. Today, more than 70% are not. And in our inner cities, it can reach as high as 80 or 90%.
80% of the people who left slavery were raising 2-parent households, and this continued up until 1962.
The black family did not start falling apart until the 1960s, as more blacks were lured into the welfare culture.
When you think about it, I mean, centuries of slavery and generations of Jim Crow did not destroy the black family. But one generation of the welfare state did.
Did LBJ's Great Society kill the black family?
That was one of the things, yes, it did. And this is why, right here in New York City, Cloud and Piven, Columbia University School of Social Work, they came out with this policy tract that says one of the ways that we can demonstrate the moral inconsistency of capitalism is to flood it with welfare recipients and make it bankrupt. Their policies alone wasn't enough. The federal government followed suit by opening up poverty offices to recruit people to the system. And Cloud and Piven said if you can detach work from income, it will make fathers redundant.
Lyndon Johnson sent people knocking on doors. I lived in the 60s, and people knocked on doors apprising women of their availability to welfare, provided there was no man in the house. And we went from 25% of blacks being born outside of wedlock in 65 to 75% right now.
No, so the last time I went to the welfare, the lady told me, said if you have a living husband, that they couldn't give you no help.
Out of humanitarian concern, fathers have left home in order for their children to get meat and bread.
Millions flooded into the welfare system in a period of 4 years at a time when the unemployment rate in New York for black men was 4%.
Between 1930 and 1970, the percentage of black white-collar workers in America quadrupled. Between 1950 and 1960, in New York City alone, the number of black accountants increased by 220%. The number of engineers grew by 134%. The number of teachers grew by 125%. Physicians and lawyers grew by more than 50%. Nurses increased by 90%, and on and on. Between 1940 and 1960, the black poverty rate in America fell by 40 percentage points. Think about that. This is before the Civil Rights Act was passed, before the Voting Rights Act was passed. This was during Jim Crow. This was during a period of open, rampant, and legal racial discrimination in this country. That's during a period when you could put a sign in your window that said, "We don't hire blacks." A 40 percentage point drop in black poverty. Over the past half century, the U.S. has spent some $20 trillion after inflation on anti-poverty programs alone. But what do we have to show for it? The official poverty rate in 2012 was higher than it had been in the mid-60s. No affirmative action program has ever come close to matching what blacks were doing on their own prior to the implementation of that affirmative action program.
In Chicago, there were 731 black-owned businesses, blacks owned in 1929, and blacks owned $100 million in real estate assets. And all over, when blacks were denied access to hotels, we didn't march on Washington, we established our own, the Wallahaji in Atlanta, the St. Teresa in New York, the St. Charles in Chicago, I can go on and on and on. When we were denied access to medical schools, we established Meharry, our own dental schools. We had our own railroad in Baltimore in 1868 when 1,000 blacks were fired. What we did was went to our churches and our burial societies and with $10,000 established the Chesapeake, Maine Dry Dock and Railroad Company that successfully ran from Baltimore to Maine. And so these are things that our young people need to know.
We began to go out of the 20 generations of slavery. We started to emerge and started to have this period of time where the communities began to come together. They were still segregated during the Jim Crow era, but we had the local physician, we had the local business, we had a place where you can go and buy goods and services. You had to go and get educated, so we had to have our own historically black colleges and universities. And so you can go and get a PhD, and all of that isn't unprecedented.
We have always had mom and pop stores in our community, whether it was to sell ice cream or sell tools, and that was how we made our money. And typically we ran businesses together as husband and wives, family. The children would be there helping. The family was strong, marriages were strong.
What happened is there were some unintended consequences when the civil rights era happened, and as a result was desegregation, not necessarily integration. The unintended consequences of that struggle is that the breakdown of businesses started to take place.
Prior to desegregation, actually my parents are in that generation in which they weren't allowed to patronize certain kinds of restaurants. In that particular environment, if you were a black-owned restaurant, you were guaranteed a certain number of customers that didn't have any other option of eating in other establishments if they wanted to eat out.
Of course, integration was great, but economically, it had a deleterious impact on our community. The first punch was we were so happy to have the opportunity to shop at Woolworth and Sears that we felt like we was sticking it to somebody by going there. Hey, I'm going to spend all my money with you and show you that my money is just as green. Then the second punch was that those retailers started recruiting my husband and me. So when I'm coming up in the 70s, the big goal of any mama, any big mama, is for her daughter or her son to get a good job at a big white company. So our would-be entrepreneurs, our talented 10th, as we call them in our community, we flocked to corporate America. And they got all our money, and they got all our talent.
The notion that black self-help is more effective than government help is not based on some right-wing, extremist, Koch brothers funded ideology. History shows repeatedly that there simply is no substitute for a group's self-development.
If white immigrants can come to this country 50 years ago with nickels and dimes and no education, and come here and pool their little nickels and dimes and no education, and set up little stores, develop these stores into larger stores, develop this into an industry which creates job opportunities for whites. Since Lincoln was supposed to have freed the black man 100 years ago, and today the black man, according to the government economist, has spending power of $20 billion per year. We feel that with the black man spending $20 billion a year, not setting up any businesses, not creating any industry, not creating any job opportunities for his own kind, he's not in a moral position to point the finger today at the white man and tell the white man that he's discriminating against him for not giving him a job in factories that he himself set up. If the black man has $20 billion, and these so-called Negro leaders are such geniuses that they can integrate white restaurants and integrate white factories and force themselves into that which the white man has set up, they should use this same ingenuity to show the black people how to pool our wealth and set up something of our own. And then we won't have to force our way into his anymore. Instead of trying to change the white man and your mind and make you accept us, we change the mind of the black man and make him accept himself. And as soon as he accepts himself, he'll solve his own problem. He won't be trying to force himself into your factory and into your bedroom and into your kitchen.